In part two, I'll be showing you how I lay out these half square triangles to create this abstract art quilt using a fabric panel. You will sort out your half square triangles based on the density and color that's in each square. You can see here how the light are going into the light. Some have a little dark, some have some light, blues, the grays, and this will help us when we go to put those half square triangles up on the design wall to create our final design. Using the layout guide on page 6 as a reference for laying out your half square triangles, you'll then start to apply them to your design wall, or you can do it on a flat lay surface that's large enough for you. You don't want to be concerned about what direction the bias seam in the half square triangle is going. We're just going for the value of each square and arranging it in a way that's pleasing to you. You don't have to do it the way that I've chosen to do it here, and you can see in the video that I do change things around as I'm putting them up. This is where the fun really begins. You get to experiment with what you like, and we're going for an abstract style. So it doesn't have to be matchy-matchy. Make it your own. You don't have to do it as I have done it. And once you get something that's pleasing, then you can start sewing it into rows. Now it's time to start sewing our rows together. We're going to start in the upper left-hand corner with our first half square triangle, and moving down the row, we will stack our half square triangles in order until we get to the bottom. You can see that I have arranged rows of half square triangles prepared to be sewn together. When you're ready to sew them together, you want to start with the first triangle at the top of your stack and attach your second, third, fourth, and fifth until you get to the end. When sewing your half square triangles together, don't be concerned about the direction of the diagonal seam of the square. Be more concerned that you have your edges matching when you're sewing these seams. This will prepare us for our rows to be sewn together and for pressing. So one pressing tip that I want to give you is that with half square triangles, I like to press my seams open. I know this may be controversial for some, but it's my preference. It also allows me to line up my points better. When you go to press these seams open, you want to hover your iron over the seam, and then once the seam is open, then apply pressure. Do this down your whole row, and I do several rows at a time before I put them up on the design wall so that we can start sewing our rows together. Now it's time to sew our rows together. I will start with row 1 and 2. Right sides together. We want to match the seams, but we also want to match the points if there are points in the seam. I like to take a pin and bring it straight through at each point on the front row and the back row, and then I'll place a pin underneath the seam allowance but before where the seam actually occurs so that it holds it in place. When I sew with my 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, I'm aiming for just to the right of where the point is so that when we press the seam open, we'll have perfect points so that they're not cut off. Now that we have our rows sewn together, it's time to press open that seam. I like to use this tool from Patterns by Annie. This is the stiletto tool. We won't be using the actual stiletto, but we'll be using the other end, which is angled. It gives us the opportunity to use pressure to open up the seam, and also where the seams come together, it gives us the opportunity to press that flat initially. Now, when we go in with our iron, we can hover over the seams and then apply pressure and hopefully not disturb any of the other seams that are pressed so nicely. Occasionally, I will catch one and then we have seam going press the wrong direction. So this does help prevent those errors in pressing. And when I flip this over, you'll see how nicely the points come together and how flat the seams are using this technique. With your 2 row sections pressed and up on the design wall, now you can start to sew those 2 row sections to their partner. And you will continue in this fashion until you have your whole quilt top sewn together and pressed. Next step is attaching the borders. You want to find the center of your border strip and do a finger press. With this pattern, there is a directional on the border, and I did take that into consideration. They are trees, and I wanted them all to be going the same direction. So I did make sure that my trees were in the right direction before attaching the border. Once you found the center on your quilt top and on your border, you want to pin that center mark and then work out to the left and right side corners and mark 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the quilt top and place a pin. That is where we will start and stop sewing. We're doing this because I have designed this quilt with mitered corners for the border. Now that we have the top and bottom border strip attached, it's time to attach the left and right side border strip. You want to be aware of the orientation of the print and match up the center of the border strip with the center of the quilt top on the left and right side edges when you pin this down. And as you work towards the bottom and to the top, you want to pin where the seam for the top and bottom border strip are attached. You do not want to sew past that seam. That is where you're going to start and where you're going to stop. With this technique, you'll get beautiful mitered corners. With all of your border strips attached to your quilt top, now it's time to press. Press your seams to the border side of the seam. Working to the corner, you will now take one of your strips and fold it 45 degrees with wrong sides together, matching the 45-degree angle to the point of the border strip that is laying on the bottom, and press. The setup for sewing your mitered corner, you will want to fold your quilt at a 45-degree angle so that both borders line up on the edge and the stitch lines line up as well. You will see that you have a crease from where we pressed our 45-degree angle into the border, and we'll open that up and pin along that crease line. This is where you'll want to stitch. When you start your stitching, you want to be sure that you do not catch the corner of your quilt top or the seam. Sew to the edge and then trim off the excess. Fold open and press. Trim off your dog ears, flip your quilt top over. You'll see that you have a beautiful mitered corner for your border, and do a final pressing because now we're going to get ready to sandwich our quilt top with batting and a backing. With your backing and batting all smooth and pressed out, now lie your quilt top down on your batting. Make sure that you have an extension of both your batting and your backing material. And now you're ready to start pinning. I use safety pins in a grid. And, always double check to make sure on the back that you don't have any wrinkles that may get quilted into your quilt. Always better to be safe than sorry. For this quilt, I used a walking foot and an undulating line coming down from the top of the quilt. I did go work back and forth from top to bottom so that there was no biasing with my quilt top. And I used an isocord thread, which is a polyester thread with a bit of a shimmer, and it was a 40 weight. And I used an 80 by 12 needle. For the quilting on this art quilt, I wanted to add some decorative thread. I'm using hand-dyed thread from Valdani and two different types of thread. They've recently started putting their 12-weight pearl cotton on a spool, and I used the colors M68, which is a soft variegated blue, and 0538, which is a natural color with some grays and tans in it. They also are starting to put their hand-dyed pearl silk on a spool, which I also used. And the colors that I used were S511 and S537. They're just beautiful. The silks have a really beautiful shimmer to them. You can put these through your sewing machine using a top stitch needle, and I used a 100 by 16, and I used a Schmetz needle. Not one problem using this thicker weight thread in your sewing machine. For the quilting with this specialty thread, some of them I ended in the middle of the quilt. When I do this, I bring the bobbin thread up through to the top so that I'm able to knot it, thread it on a needle, and then bury my tails so that they aren't seen when the quilt is finished and all of that decorative stitching is secured. In this video, we have covered a lot from sewing our half square triangles together to laying out our art quilt to quilting our art quilt. Thank you for joining me today, and stay tuned for our next part of this fabric panel art quilt. In part 3, we'll cover binding and squaring up a quilt. And also I'm going to show you how to attach a hanging sleeve and how to create one. So if you've liked what you've seen, like, subscribe, leave a comment. Always appreciated. Until next time, happy stitching.